Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
Now Nigerians updated and people watching from wherever that is comfortable for them to watch from. Whether it's the UK, it's the US, it's South Africa. Yes, you updated on current happenings. Now, I mentioned Nigerians for a particular reason because one of the items in the news talked about the issues with the petrol supply in Nigeria. As the NNPCL has raised the price of petrol to 125 naira in Lagos and 1,025 naira in Lagos, I beg your pardon, and 1,060 naira in Abuja. Well, there are also queues noticed in some parts of the country, and the hope before this time was that when Dangote refinery commences operation, all of this will be history. But according to Dangote refinery, they do have enough PMS available, petroleum products available to serve Nigeria, but they wonder why marketers have not lifted these products from the refinery. This issue sometimes gives a headache because there's a lot of back and forth regarding this. It's now looking like the more you take a look at the issues, the less you see. Like there's some mysteries around this issue. Well, we do hope that in short time, all of this will be resolved. Nigerians are very resilient people. So this is just an encouragement to say we've survived all this while. We can do much more to ensure that this doesn't deter the push to ensure that the economy moves forward in whatever way that you can see production. If you are a producer, in whatever way you can see that daily economic activity from your end continues, of course, do that. Now, I know that end users, customers sometimes are the ones who bear the brunt when things like this happen. But hey, life will still go on. Not to look at some depressing matters too much, let's move now to what's happening in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where the 8th edition of the Future Investment Initiative Summit 2024 is ongoing. I did promise that I'll be joined on the show by a delegate in that conference. And this morning, we will be looking at the key takeaways of this global platform for policy leaders, business leaders, to attend to the factors shaping the global economy and bringing out innovations to see that there is growth across the board. And so we're focusing on creating growth and jobs. What this conference is presenting in that regard. Joining the conversation virtually is Dr. Patrick Basham, who is the founding director of Democracy Institute, Washington, D.C., and former adjunct scholar and senior fellow of the Cato Institute. Good morning, Dr. Basham. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Good to be back with you. Pleasure to be with you again. And good morning from Riyadh.
Thank you. It's been almost a year. The last time was the 7th edition of the FII.
Yes.
All right. This is the 8th edition, and you were there as a delegate. This is the second day of the summit itself. There were pre-summit meetings, but now the summit is started. What does it look like? Talking about investment opportunities, what areas are being focused on right now?
Well, it's so far, it's looking like 2023 on steroids. By that, I mean that last year, my first year here, there was a great deal of emphasis on green energy and on AI in particular. I mean, technology in all its facets, but particularly in those two areas. And so far, it appears that those subjects have taken on, even more life and energy and enthusiasm and interest from the delegates and from the speakers, particularly on the AI front. It's almost as if AI is a conference within a conference, and so because this conference brings together truly just global leaders. I'm not talking simply politicians, but people actually working in these fields, then you're really hearing some sort of cutting edge information. You're being given some really esoteric knowledge, and you have people in that area who are incredibly optimistic. Maybe they would say they're just realistic, as one gentleman put it this morning. Their focus in terms of funding ventures is all about figuring out, where the hockey puck is going to be, and going then that direction rather than looking at where we are today and figuring out how do we make money from the status quo. So it's whether it's AI, whether it's green energy, across the other area, more traditional areas, you might say, finance and investment and economic policy making. It's about being proactive and a tremendous emphasis on being disruptive, being creative, being innovative. And so that makes it, once again, a stimulating experience and hopefully a constructive and a productive one.
Okay, I'm going to pick the AI part first. Let's talk about that. You understand that there is a technology divide, and this is a summit where you have thousands of delegates from different parts of the world, some of them from areas that seem a bit disadvantaged when you talk about technology. How is that gap being closed at this summit?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't want to speak for the organizers, but I think the presumption would be that the gap can't be closed in a short period of time, but perhaps indicators can be given as to how to at least narrow that gap. And I think first and foremost, it's the approach of this summit and the previous summits, which is it's very inclusive, very interactive. It's not in the tradition of the World Economic Forum at Davos in Switzerland, which is, a smaller group of people telling everybody else what they should know and therefore what they should do. Here, it's very much a case of the organizers bring together people in this area, in this case, AI, and allow them to speak, you might say, organically from their particular niches. And then the delegates, whether they are from technology wealthy parts of the world or more technology poor parts of the world or somewhere in between, for them to interact and to, as it were, take away the knowledge that might not, the value added that might not be available to them in their domestic context.
Area of renewable energy, there is still some form of debate while the West is moving towards renewable energy. If you look at the developing countries or underdeveloped countries, there's still much activity around fossil fuel ongoing. At a summit like this, where is the focus at this point? Is it totally on renewable energy? Are there talks around finding a common ground of creating an energy mix?
Well, to date, to this point, at least to the opening of this conference, I think that the future investment initiatives focus has been on renewable energies and moving beyond fossil fuels. However, and again, I'm not speaking for the organizers, but I'm speaking in terms of the impression that I have, that I think that this conference is starting, and as you're suggesting, in your question, this conference, like the wider policy environment globally, is starting to reflect an understanding and appreciation that fossil fuels are not going away anytime soon. In fact, some prominent people think they shouldn't go away at all, and that even if we transition, it's going to be costly and it's going to be a bumpy road. And what does that, whichever direction we go, what does that mean for developing countries who are, to this point, being told, if not always being given, that the assistance is coming? If the West is telling the global South, for example, we must all do this, then we're going to help you do what we say you must do. Even if you put aside the notion of whether that's the right way of deciding things in the global South, for example, it's no longer, I think, unanimous in the West that we're going to go all in on renewables is actually the way we're going to go. And with various elections throwing up new governments and new leaders, and we'll see what happens next week in the United States, increasingly there's a mix of political and policy viewpoints and perspectives on this. So I think balance is probably where we're headed, both at the Future Investment Initiative this year and going forward, and obviously more widely, in the world as it deals with these problems on a day-to-day basis.
Talking about growth, last year the summit did major lots around emerging markets. Are there new dynamics around the emerging markets, and how's that playing in this summit?
Well, so far it's been interesting. I mean, we had the pre-summit that you touched on in your introduction, which was almost exclusive, not exclusively, but a lot of it was about the African context. Every facet of what could, should, would, may not happen in Africa economically, and what the challenges were, and what the potential problems might be, or disappointments. And then the first formal day yesterday, there was a major discussion on what the prospects are for good or bad news economically in the global South more broadly. So emerging markets, perhaps less formally than last year, but they're definitely having their sort of time in the sun, literally and figuratively, here in Saudi Arabia. There's a tremendous, I mean, for Africa to get so much attention, have it almost pre-summit of its own, I think reflects the fact that the global nature of this event is taken very seriously, and the African component is especially taken seriously. It's seen as, I think, the coming geographical regional element to a summit such as this.
How does the lack of infrastructure in some parts of Africa impede discussions when some of them are trying to woo investors into certain aspects of the economy?
No, you've raised the really one of the toughest questions, because even if an African country, from a Western investor's point of view, gets its policy and its regulatory mix right, if there isn't the physical infrastructure or the infrastructure in terms of social capital, whether it's education and other areas, then that capital might still come, but become frustrated because there isn't the ability to sort of connect all the necessary dots from the investor's point of view, or that capital doesn't come in the first place. So again, I think it's a little bit, well, it's very analogous. In fact, it's interwoven with the green energy, renewable energy, fossil fuel discussion of, is it necessary for at least some African countries to be sort of band-aided in an infrastructure sense to ensure that they can actually fulfill their potential, even if, assuming that they get their policy and regulatory mix right. But of course, I think one of the reasons that we're not seeing unanimity from a Western point of view in terms of what should happen on infrastructure in African countries is that more often than not, Western investors think, and Western governments think, that the regulatory and policy mix isn't right, and therefore you'd be sort of throwing, from a Western point of view, throwing good money after bad. But again, more to be debated, because certainly the answer isn't clear cut.
Even as that debate is ongoing, let's look at some of the issues that makes it difficult sometimes for Africa to achieve some of the infrastructure needs that it has. When we talk about some of the challenges that the world is currently battling, we cannot but mention climate change. And we understand that at firms like this, there have been talks around funds to help countries mitigate the effects of climate change. Is that discussion a burning one right now at the summit?
It's certainly a very real and tangible one. I don't know if I'd say it was a burning one, probably a little, not quite as hot as last year. And again, I think that reflects two things. One, the fact that in macro terms, the economic situation in most parts of the world is less good or worse than it was last year. And so that focuses the mind, rightly or wrongly, on more immediate economic and financial concerns. And the other is really continuation of what I was just touching on earlier, which is that there are more numerous and more influential voices who are saying that either the climate change issue isn't as great a challenge as we've been led to believe, or that there is a challenge here and it is impacting African nations, often to a greater degree than others, but it isn't necessarily something that we have the control over that has been the conventional wisdom to this point. So until that Western debate is concluded, as most people thought it had been, but it apparently it's not been, then it's going to be very hard to know whether the debate at a discussion at a summit such as this is going to kick off again, or it's going to not fade away, but become a secondary issue in a way that perhaps it had been in the past, but in recent times, obviously, had come very much to the forefront.
Now, while talking about infrastructure deficits in Africa and some of the challenges in Africa, you mentioned education. Looking at the education gap, and this is a summit where there are new ideas, innovations, research and development is very, very key at a summit like that. What policies are going on around that to improve or change the narrative in that region?
Well, I think in a broader sense, whether it comes to education or other areas, but education is a good example. At a summit like this, I think one of the stimulating creative aspects is that the approach is, let's sort of hear from everyone. Let's not presume we know the answer. Let's hear what people think the answer is, or the answer has been in their city, their region, their country, etc. What does their research tell us? And then do other people want to pick that up and run with it? Right. And so education obviously it can be a tangible example of that. And when it gets to the specifics, I think what we're seeing at this summit and more broadly in certainly Western discussions about education is an appreciation that we have over many decades transitioned from an almost exclusively private form of education to an almost exclusively state or government-run form of education. And we've increasingly people think that we have we've removed a lot of bad outcomes from an over-reliance on the private sector or private funding to different but equally bad outcomes, maybe even worse outcomes, but over-reliance on the state sector. And that there might be lessons for African nations in terms of how they approach, in macro terms, education. That, of course, doesn't answer the question, well, if there's a continuation of private education or more reliance on it, where does that funding come from? Is that domestic? Is it domestic taxpayers, government, or is it Western governments, or is it philanthropists, whether they're Western or not? And the discussion that happened yesterday about young entrepreneurship in Africa, I know you're asking me about education, but young entrepreneurs, often the genesis or the stimuli for their making their own way is the fact that they are hampered by an education system that doesn't give them the opportunities. So these things are all tied in together. And I just have to check because I think I have. Okay.
Going now to attend some events at the summit. I know you'll be back.
It's actually
after
I actually
a while.
have good.
Well, thank you so much for joining in. I look forward to when you get back so we can continue the conversation.
Okay, thank you. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for staying with us in Early Exchange. We've been talking about the ongoing Future Investment Initiative Summit in Saudi Arabia. Earlier on, I had a delegate from that summit join in, Dr. Patrick Basham, and now he's gone on a break. He will be back at the course of the show. Before he left off, he was of the opinion that when it comes to education and bridging the gap, some regions seem to have taken a different route that is giving them the result they currently have. And by that, he meant the West taking education away from the hands of the private sector and the state owning it. He recommended that Africa learn something from that. Now, if we look at the way education is run, I would use Nigeria as a case study because I am in Nigeria and we're reaching you live from Nigeria. My other guest in the studio who would respond to the comments of Dr. Basham lives in Nigeria. So let's just use Nigeria as a case study, reacting to what Dr. Basham said. I have Sam Orovwuje, who is a public affairs and international analyst in the studio. Good morning, sir. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Blessing. Thank you.
I'm very enthusiastic about getting your opinion on this. So Dr. Basham highlighted what the West have been able to do with education. If we're talking about growth, and at a global forum like this, if growth is one of the key issues being discussed, the place of education is very paramount. Now, in Nigeria, we find that education is leaving the hands or the control, the ownership of the state to private individuals. So take the primary, secondary schools as an example. You find a lot of them being owned by private individuals. Move now to tertiary institutions. We now have many tertiary institutions. Now, does it seem like this approach that Nigeria still uses or is using now in its education in a way is creating some challenges for quality education and affordable education?
Blessing, thank you. I don't think so. Essentially, a greater majority of the education sector is still within the framework of government, while there are private initiative in terms to bridge the gap in terms of enrollment. Governments here have a greater role to play in terms of policy, in terms of control of schools. But then when the West is talking about maybe education is moving away from private sector into the government, I don't think so. There's a balancing act here, particularly in Nigeria, where you have a new investment opportunity in terms of private universities or private tertiary institutions, while the government, on the other hand, still play a major role in terms of providing enrollment in terms of higher education to students. Even the government in recent time has even provided an opportunity in terms of a scholarship loan that is given to indigent students so that they can enroll in public schools and find a way to cushion the effect of the massive investment that you require to get some high level of education in Nigeria.
Well, there's some good news. Dr. Patrick Basham, who is the founding director of the Democracy Institute, Washington, D.C., and former adjunct scholar and senior fellow of the Cato Institute, a delegate at the ongoing Future Investment Initiative Summit, is back with us virtually. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's very kind of you to say it's good news that I'm back. Not everyone would necessarily agree at all times.
All right, so let's continue from where we left off, talking about education. At a summit like this, where you have industry leaders looking for new minds, new ideas, are there certain skills that industry leaders are looking for in new entrepreneurs, new graduates that may be at this summit that perhaps the current education system is not paying attention to? The research that could help in this area?
No, actually, I'd almost believe that you were here with us because you've really captured what struck me last year and is very much centerpiece this year, which is a tremendous focus, both in terms of delegates and also especially in terms of speakers, on young entrepreneurs, especially in the tech area, the tech space. And what that reflects, I think, is the fact that this summit, the organizers have an appreciation that the sort of traditional old-fashioned notion of someone having achieving certain formal academic credentials, and therefore they will have a successful career, therefore they will produce sort of a value-added contribution the rest of us will benefit with. That does happen, but it is not a sort of a one-to-one ratio. It's not a given that it happens. In fact, often it does not happen. And most value added in a creative sense, in an economic or financial sense, of course, comes from entrepreneurs, disproportionately those who are young and either confident or reckless, risk tolerant at a younger age. And they often have unusual academic backgrounds, or not much of an academic background, or an unpredictable, non-traditional path to where they are now. And so the summit has, at least in the 2 years that I've been here, is really making an effort successfully to bring them here, wherever they are found around the world, and give them real serious time in the spotlight so they can explain their story. And it's a way, I think, of it does achieves many potential purposes, goals. But I think one of the most important things it does is it tells everybody else in the room, especially the younger delegates, that there is no right and wrong way of becoming prosperous, of creating wealth for yourself and for others, about creating new products and services that are going to serve all of us potentially. You can go about this in an idiosyncratic way. You can go about it in a unique way, in a niche way. And that is a message that I think until recently has not been heard or received in most parts of the world. But as in so many policy areas, and education being one of them, we have, I think, belatedly come to the conclusion, or reached the conclusion, that we've assumed that we knew more than we did about what works, and that what works had to be a very uniform, singular approach, education being a good example. Used to be all private in the West, and it became almost all government run. And so I think the Future Investment Initiative, their approach to young entrepreneurs, epitomizes how we need to revisit what we consider the best or right approach in that and other areas of economic life.
Okay, I'm going to take the conversation now to Sam Orovwuje, who is a guest in the studio. He's a public and international affairs analyst. Now, having heard Dr. Basham, it seemed like what the summit is going to do is revolutionize the global industry with new ideas, new thinking. What are your expectations from those who are participating at the summit? They represent different countries. What new thing do you expect to see happening in the global economy after now?
No, I think it's essentially about cross-fertilization of ideas, innovation and creativity, and to what extent can entrepreneurs, investors take advantage of this creativity and innovation, particularly for Africa. I saw in one of the elements in the conference that puts a spotlight on the music and the creative industry in Africa. What are the potentials? What are the opportunities? To what extent can investors take advantage of the new investment using modern technologies in terms of AI? And how can this impact positively on that industry? And how can we scale up the industry? And potentially looking at investment that come into Africa, particularly between Africa and the Middle East, and how they can take advantage of these opportunities. I think the cross-fertilization of ideas and opening up the space using creativity, innovation as a means of scaling up industry, small and medium enterprise, for me, would be the major cash for the conference.
All right, now to you, Dr. Basham. If we're talking about scaling up, which is the aim of many business leaders, entrepreneurs at the summit, funding is very crucial. Now, this is an investment platform. As I talk about ideas, there are firms who are looking for where to put money. What are the events surrounding this for investment firms? And on the other hand, those who are looking to cash in on this opportunity, what do you think they should be doing? What have you seen them do?
Right. Well, there's a lot of all of that going on here. There are actually parts of the program where deals that have been made are formally announced with great fanfare, sometimes between governments and industry, sometimes without government involvement. But one of the things that happens here is that sort of informally, because obviously there's a networking component, is that venture capitalists and others are identifying projects in not necessarily that were featured in the program, but in terms of the organic interaction between delegates and speakers and delegates, and making progress from their point of view in terms of where their funds are invested that way. And then another element that is a formal element, at least the initial stage, is that there are these formal public opportunities to pitch one's ideas. So you have not exclusively younger, but generally younger entrepreneurs, again, disproportionately in the tech space, who have what they feel is a great idea, but as so many would-be startup entrepreneurs face the challenge of, well, I don't have the money for the R&D, I have the money to get it off the ground, even if I have actually created a viable product. And so they have an opportunity to pitch to those with deep pockets, whether individuals or institutions, and literally sell their idea. Some successfully, some not so. So that's something that has been going on, I think, for a number of years, and takes on larger and larger life each year. So in different ways, we see how the summit, rather than just being a talking shop, and I think in a very, although that would be unfair to say that part of it exists, but that part of it is much more dynamic than that label I just threw on it would suggest. But as well as that, it's not just about, okay, what can we do? What should we do? What do you think we should do? It's actually doing stuff. People who have ideas, they had an idea yesterday or last week or last year, they've worked on it, and now they have an opportunity in front of people who can make a real tangible difference to their ideas viability. And if the idea is actually something that is being proven to have utility in the marketplace, then can they attract the funding, etc., so that there is the possibility of scaling that product, that service, in a way that most of these entrepreneurs, dream will be the case for their company.
Now, if I go to the flyer for this event, which is also been displayed on the screen, we'll find that there are high-profile speakers selected for the summit, and they're going to be speaking around different issues. The world has always had geopolitical tensions, but recently it's become more of a challenge to trade and business. How is the summit breaking that barriers with speakers drawn from different sectors and background?
Well, in theory, if you have speakers from different backgrounds, different regions, different ages, races, religions, etc., then there is the potential, the opportunity for certain presumptions and prejudices and stereotypes to at least be perhaps watered down when reality, meets myth, shall we say? But we know from contemporary history and from history in the larger sense that isn't always the case. In fact, often it is not the case. So I wouldn't want to suggest that simply the diversity makes a difference. But what I think gives the diversity the possibility of actually making a difference here in Riyadh rather than in some comparable events is the fact that it is an organic environment, is an interactive one. It's one that sort of has a holistic approach. It may be an exaggeration to say it's bottom up, but it's certainly not top down. And I think one of the interesting things that certainly the past couple of years has featured very strongly is that before the summit, the organizers commission a global survey where ordinary people and business people around the world in as many countries as is possible are surveyed about what are the issues that are important to them, what are the things they like to see change, what are the things that they're worried, is it the economy, corruption, migration, the environment, whatever it may be. I say all this because then that data, those results are then brought to bear on how the agenda is formed. And it's also something that then is part and parcel of how the discussions are moderated and the direction in which the organizers not lead the summit, but rather make the summit delegates and speakers aware that they shouldn't be and are not operating in a bubble, that what they are doing, it's being done, it's being organized for the goal of actually making a difference at some point somewhere. And therefore, what the world beyond Riyadh actually is concerned about and actually wants to see change or be doubled down on, whether it's a good news or bad news response in these surveys, that matters. You're only going to succeed economically, financially, politically, environmentally, socially, culturally, if the wider world buys into what it is that you are selling, figuratively or literally. So I think that is that's really important, might be one of the most important value added in my experience, of the Future Investment Initiative.
Okay, Dr. Basham, let me take this down to Sam Orovwuje in the studio. Looking at that, different key speakers drawn from different backgrounds, and we understand, like Dr. Basham has said, there may be prejudices from different people, you've seen different race and people believing in different ideologies or make their presentations. And there is, it's a place where you have diversity. If you have 7,000 delegates or more in one place, then that is bound to happen. But it seems to be a battle of pitches. People dropping their pitch, talking about their region, markets selling themselves, businesses selling themselves. But if the focus of the summit is creating infinite horizons, endless opportunities, now what do you think should be a key thing for markets selling themselves? Let's use Africa as an example. Like I said, it's a battle of pitches, and there is opportunity for networking. You have different speakers, you have different people. What should be the key factor of distinction for any market? For example, the African market, as pitches flow everywhere.
I think for me is, like I said earlier, I think is the Future Investment Conference is where ideas are pitched to entrepreneurs and investors. So for Africa, what is key, to what extent can we drive in more investment, particularly from the Middle East, which is a kind of investment gateway based on this future investment. What is key in terms of the diversity of ideas and innovations in the marketplace? People will pitch for different markets. I saw something on creative industry. I saw something on artificial intelligence and new technologies, even new energy and all that. Those opportunities are there. So to what extent can we tap on these opportunities where you have an opportunity to meet investors? Entrepreneurs are able to put this idea forward. Once these ideas are sustainable ideas, investors will put their money in those ventures, and those ventures will improve on the economic prosperity of various countries that are delegates in that conference, and they're able to bring to bear this innovation, these ideas, which they can translate into real product and services, which will help to sustain specific markets in specific sectors and specific country. But Africa must find a way to see how we can bring more investment, close this strategic initiative between the Middle East and Africa, and see how we can take advantage of the opportunity in spite of the challenges of infrastructure in Africa.
All All right, Dr. Basham, let's take this to the political arena a bit. So the U.S. election is forthcoming, and even though this is not the focus at the summit, do you think in any way, because of the trade implications that could be there, whichever party at the end of the day emerges winner of the election, how do you see this bringing a coloration to discussions?
Well, actually, I mean, your question is again,
okay.
Right.
The U.S. election is fast approaching. Now, there is always a political side to business interest. Now, do you see this forthcoming election giving a coloration to discussions from businesses in the West to other parts of the world? Do you also see that being a consideration from the other areas, responding to maybe business proposals from other businesses that have come from the West?
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. To give you one example, later on today, there's a segment of the program where a very prominent American opinion pollster has surveyed American CEOs of larger sized companies to ask them what their hopes and fears are about the outcome of the presidential election, what they think that means for America economically, but also America's trading relationships with the rest of the world, and what they think the rest of the world, how the rest of the world will respond. So that tells you that the people here, I think, and you just get this, individually, anecdotally. Everybody, I've come here from Washington. I spent a lot of time surveying American voters about the election. Everyone wants to know what's going to happen, and if X happens, what does that mean? If Y happens, what does that mean? And it's especially, the American presidential election is always going to be important to global investors and policymakers, etc., for obvious reasons. However, this election, I think, is perceived, and probably fairly accurately, as such a stark choice when it comes to issues of international economic policy and foreign policy, geopolitics, America's role vis-a-vis the world, multilateralist versus more, whether you view it as isolationist or nationalistic. And so everyone is keenly aware that whatever their preferences personally or institutionally or economically, financially, that the outcome of next week's election is going to matter, not merely for Americans, as it always does, but matter for the rest of the world, which you could say, well, it always does. But I think the perception, certainly here in Riyadh at this summit, is that it's going to matter even more than usual. And so I think it does color these discussions. And I imagine that going forward, once we have an outcome, whatever that may be, that there are going to be many people, not just in America, but around the world, from these types of profile of these delegates, who are going to be massively, rapidly trying to assess what either the continuation of the path America is currently on, and has been for 4 years, or quite a divergence. What does that mean for them? What does that mean for their region, their country, their marketplace?
On a final note, I'm going to ask you this. This is the 8th edition of the Future Investments Initiative. There are plans to have an African version, maybe sometime next year, I believe. Now, what have you seen so far? This is the second time you're attending the FII. What have you seen so far that you're looking forward to when there is an African version?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a plan to have one next year, as I understand it. And I can see just in the growth of interest in Africa in the summit, just in the two I've attended, there was considerable interest, both in terms of the program, the speakers, the delegates last year. But that has ratcheted up. There's no question. As I say, a pre-summit day was mostly about Africa, and yet an African continues to feature in the formal parts of the program. And so I think the organizers have recognized that there is both the potential in Africa to play a greater role in the global economy and the global financial life of the planet, and obviously the planet's environmental future. But also, there's greater demand from Africa to have a seat at the table, to have a voice in the discussion, to be one of those who have the opportunity regionally to be interactive with the people who are the most influential financially, who are still obviously not exclusively but disproportionately Western, and if not Western, at least Middle Eastern or Asian. So I think for all these reasons, it's almost certain that Africa will continue to play a greater role in this summit. And I think that tells you that Africa will continue to play an increasingly important role in policy making and economic and financial policy decision making around the world beyond this summit. That is simply the way the world is moving. And that is the opportunity and the challenge for African countries going forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patrick Basham, founding director of the Democracy Institute, Washington, D.C., and former adjunct scholar and senior fellow of the Cato Institute, for your time with us on the show today. We wish you a great experience at the summit. We may have to bring you back before the end of the summit to talk on other issues as they evolve there.
It would be my great pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, Sam Orovwuje, you've heard what Dr. Basham said about his hopes for Africa, but other key sectors that you think should be getting ready in anticipation for Africa's turn of having a future investment summit?
I think it's the entire sectors within the continent. Every sector must come to the table to see how we can calibrate a future for Africa in terms of economic growth, development, and economic prosperity for Africans.
Thank you very much. Sam Orovwuje, public and international affairs analyst, speaking to the emerging developments at the ongoing Future Investment Initiative. It's the 8th edition and is happening there in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Africa looks to have its turn, but preparation meets opportunities. That's what wise people say. So it's expected that Africa would prepare for that opportunity.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.